Welcome, virtual space hero community, to another LinkedIn Live, a virtual conversation with experts from across the globe about the virtual way of working. Today, we're going to discuss a topic that is particularly interesting because there has been so many huge discussions and very heated discussions also around it. It was proposed by one of my favorite thought leaders in the field, Nancy Settle-Murphy, who will be joining me immediately on the stage. And it is about how we can use magnets versus mandates in the return to office discussion. And the fun thing is, I was just thinking back to the year 2021, it was, where I was running workshops for one of my clients. And it was for the senior leadership team about new ways of working, virtual work and everything, so that they get accustomed with the idea that our way of working together has changed, right? And that hybrid options are necessary in today's organization. So all went super well during that discussion, but suddenly in October, one of the middle managers complained about their employees being back home with the very often heard argument, not working, but rather Facebooking or doing something else. And suddenly the senior management team decided from one day to another to recall all the employees back to the office. They organized meetups, lunches, and coffee breaks together. So in order to have employees like a little bit more happy with the decision that they needed to come back, only to, listen to that, having to send them back to home office like 3 or 4 weeks later because the next Corona Omicron wave joined Austria, the Austrian environment at that point. And we have seen in the news about Twitter, for example, who called employees back, then again sent them back to the home office. And we see that the discussion is really tremendous, right? We see that managers and employees in their need or requests for remote work and how to deal with the return to the office, there is like really a big gap. And today we're picking up on a concept that Nancy proposed to me to talk about mandates and magnets. And with that, I'm welcoming Nancy Settle-Murphy on the stage, connecting from the US. Hi, Nancy.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for joining us again. It is fantastic. You proposed a really great title. How is it that you came up with this question, and what is triggering that question also for you in your current projects?
Well, more and more employers I'm finding are requiring that employees be back in their office, not their home office, but the work office. I'd say an average of 2 to 3 days a week seems to be the average. Some with no rationale at all, some because they think the culture is stronger or that people can connect better, both of which I will dispute to some degree. So what inspired me to propose this topic is what I see is there are some companies that are just having people come back to work at their cubicles, doing everything they could do from home in the same way they were doing it from home. And then there are some organizations that are making being back in the office, that are coming up with some intentional gatherings, activities, learning sessions, and have given employees a lot more flexibility. So in short, they're making it much more attractive to make that often horrendous commute versus simply mandating that they come in to do their desk work.
Mm-mm. Nancy, when you think back, I know that you have been a remote pioneer for many years. So when you think back about the first time that you were able to work remotely, what was it that it caused with you or in you?
Well, I started working almost completely remotely on 9/11 back in 2001 when some of my biggest clients who had hired me to do face-to-face facilitation work around the world suddenly stopped anyone from flying and challenged me to convert all of the workshops that I ran, all of the training sessions, to do that virtually. So for me, that was tough. It was a tough pivot for me, and I had to, or I risked losing many of my clients. So once I settled into the remote work, the remote world, I actually loved it because at the time I had small kids at home, and so I could help put them on the bus, volunteer in their classrooms, and do my work from home. So for me, in the position I was in my life, it was a huge blessing.
Mm-mm. And if you look at the discussion now, so that you also were forced, as many of us or most of us were forced in 2020, what is the discussion and what are the arguments that you hear from your clients? If you look at managers and employees arguing against each other, what are the arguments that you're hearing in your work?
Well, I think the discrepancy between managers and employees continues to be huge, whereas managers would very much like to see people back in the office. When I say managers, I'm more referring to senior leaders. I think department managers who have more say over it tend to be more flexible. But I think senior leaders just want it the way it was. I want people back in, the culture, the connection, the socialization, the productivity. So, and then employees, the great majority, in all research I've seen, has said the great majority would like the flexibility to work at home at least 2 to 3 days a week. Now, there are
Mm.
exceptions, and it depends on the job and the generation and the location and the industry. But in general, there's that gap that I don't see closing anytime soon.
Absolutely. And it is interesting because the discussion is all around. Sometimes it's about culture that you already said that you don't believe in that the culture is stronger when we're together, right? But also there's a lot of discussion or argumentation around the topic of we are more creative or innovation happens, brainstorming is better when we do it together and stuff like that. So what is it that what is your opinion regarding the culture argument? We need again to be closer together, to not lose our bond or forget about our values.
That's a great question. And I'd say it's somewhere in the middle, in that I think that occasional face to face and intentional face to face gatherings, whether it's social events, brainstorming sessions, cross departmental meetings, internal or external focus groups. I think that coming together, at least on occasion, absolutely cements relationships, creates a bond, and makes it a lot easier to collaborate and coordinate once you go back to your remote offices, wherever you're working. So I do think that a healthy dose of face to face is really critical for relationship building. However, I think those times of getting together should be planful, intentional. It should be times where your colleagues are going to be there, or a new hire is going to be there, or uh, your colleagues from another location are visiting. So it should be intentional, and there should be opportunities for gathering versus just doing work. But I do think that culture is very much about how we work, our values and beliefs, and not about where we work.
Mm-mm. And I think you mentioned there one of the most important words also for me, and that has to do a lot, or it's very important for me in hybrid work settings to think about the intentionality of where we meet, when we meet, how we communicate, how often we communicate, what we communicate about, and where, and so on. So I think intentionality or being intentional is really one of the key aspects when we think about working together in general, but we have seen that it becomes so much more important in virtual or hybrid settings even, right?
Yes, and I just want to build on that. During COVID, when we all worked all virtually, or many people did, what we've seen is that your own team got tighter. You actually built stronger relationships. Oftentimes, those were the only adults you talked to all day long, in the world of COVID. I think what's really been missing are those weak ties, those peripheral relationships for people in other departments, or someone maybe whose name you don't even know, but you saw at the coffee machine every day. I think that was really missing during
Mm.
COVID. And now, when we come back into the office, some of my clients actually are very thoughtful about, let's say, the first Wednesday of every month, everyone comes into the office and we'll have all hands gatherings or training sessions or cross department brainstorming sessions where you get to meet, or in some cases meet for the first time, but you get to exchange ideas and knowledge with others outside of your own team.
Mm.
That was a huge piece that was missing, that I think we can take advantage of if we plan the office time thoughtfully.
Hmm. I think that's a really interesting argument that I, in this case, have not heard yet. Like the way that you're proposing it, that with your immediate team, maybe you were not losing the bond, but it's rather those out of your own departmental silo that you are losing the contact to other departments through the maybe remote work setup. Is that correct? Just to put it in.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It's an interesting argument, like that a lot. Nancy, you were proposing the title of today's question topic, magnets and mandates. So, how would you use magnets instead of mandates? And what do you mean by that in the return to office discussion?
Well, great question. Another great question. So mandates, there and really I've seen a spectrum, but in general, there a company at a senior level will mandate an RTO, a return to office policy, that may be, for example, as prescriptive as all employees must be on site 4 days a week, and those 4 days are Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Or a mandate might be all employees must be 3 days a week and they can pick the 3 days. One might be everyone has to spend, I have one client who said, I believe it's 5 days a month in the office. So it
Mm,
really varies. But most organizations I work with have some kind of policy by now established at a corporate level. So those mandates are often translated differently by department managers. They're often ignored by employees. I see a lot of that. So a mandate is you must be in these days, you must do this. Whereas a magnet is something that will cause the employee to be glad that they made that commute. They are glad that they actually are in the office. So a magnet would be give me a reason, whether it's a training session, a chance to meet with senior leaders, maybe a breakfast session with senior executives, cross-functional team meetings, a social gathering around a theme, a fun theme. What isn't really working are free lunch, free breakfast, free coffee. That works for some, but in general, I'd say most employees I've talked to don't really make that loss of flexibility worth a free lunch. They can eat at home whatever they want.
mm, mm. Great point. And I'm just coming back to your mandates argument or mandates, what you were explaining. I even know, and that's the only company or organization I heard about that they are using a mandate on a yearly basis that people can work from home. And that's really interesting because they have like 1 or 2 days per week, but you see that on a yearly basis that you can or cannot work from the office or from home. Nancy, I think you brought there a lot of points to the surface, arguments to the surface that are so important to consider. So you were also talking about return to office RTO policies. What do you see or what are you suggesting should organizations consider when they start communicating those processes? How should we communicate around that? And how do we build those processes? Have you experienced with bottom up where employees be part of it, or is that a rather top down decision process that you experience with your work?
Well, I think in general, it's what I've experienced, it's been top down. What I think it should be is bottom up. Because what we see are often, I think I read recently, 70% of the return to office policy decisions were made only by senior leaders talking to each other. I hope that's wrong, but that's what I read. So I think the best way to communicate is to get the employee input, excuse me, very early on and bounce ideas off of them, give them the rationale, and go touch base with some more your influential employees. Excuse me, I need water. At all levels. So start the conversation early. Don't wait until you've formulated a policy behind closed doors and announce it. That rarely works. So I think there has to be a rationale behind it. Why are we asking you to come in, for example, 3 days a week? What are we going to provide to you that's different? Make a case for why we believe you can do your work better here. But I think it really has to be a two-way conversation early on.
Mm, 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 mm. These are very valuable points, and we do know that all that top-down versus bottom-up discussion throughout the whole change and other communication leadership topics, we see that always occurring, and still we are not there yet where we find a good balance in organizations on how to deal with the top-down, bottom-up question, right? A quick note here at this point, you see that Nancy is also tagged in the event. Connect with Nancy on LinkedIn, Nancy Settle Murphy, and also check out guidedinsights.com, where you find a communique, a newsletter subscription possibility, and her very valuable blog with a lot of great articles, knowledge, content about virtual and hybrid work. So this really must sign up for you out there. Nancy, coming back to the question, so we need to be careful on how to set up, but also how to communicate a return to the office policy. What about the leaders? What is their role, and how do you see that? Is that happening in the organizations that you follow or that you work with?
Well, it really varies. I think one of the most important role of the leaders is to communicate the rationale and to equip their managers and supervisors, the real people leaders, with the information they need to communicate the policy. But also, I think what's key is to give managers and supervisors the tools and the autonomy to make decisions as a team. So, for example, one team leader, let's say in accounting, the nature of the work might be very easily done remotely. And there's very little reason people need to come in X number of days a week. Whereas it could be, let's say, in a facilities group or an IT group, depending on what their job is, they may need to be there on site more often. So I think the most important thing for senior leaders is to realize they don't know the work like the people who manage people know the work. So give the managers autonomy and parameters by which they need to work within. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's one of the most important things. And then the other thing is, assuming senior leaders are on site, if they're asking others to be on site, then they should be, in my opinion. Make it an occasion. Go drop in on people. Organize meetings. Come up with some maybe office hours where senior leaders, anyone can come in and ask questions. Give the people who take the time to come to the office, give them some exposure and visibility to senior leaders.
Mm, mm, mm. So, what would you say overall if we just think about, okay, communicating an RTO policy, we have the leader's role. What are important or essential elements for such a return to office policy or in general a hybrid work policy? Because some organizations are already sort of already crossed the
Yeah.
river to the return to office, but they already returned to some extent. But how should those hybrid work policies, what elements should they have?
Well, I think above all, a guiding principle is how do we maintain equity no matter where people work? And I don't mean just work location, but it also might be there's certain people who are more disadvantaged if they have to come into the office than others. So, how do we take those? So there might be mobility issues, caregiving responsibilities, transportation difficulties. There might be a number of factors that make it harder for some people to come back to the office or not as attractive or not as productive. So I think we need to take all that into account when we establish those policies. So the policies, it may not be the same for you or me, depending where we are, what the nature of our work was, what our life is like. So I
Mm,
think equity is the most important guiding principle. And then
mm,
beyond that, I think there needs to be some flexibility, some period of testing and refinement. And hey, is this working? Were we right? Are we seeing greater productivity when people are in 3 days? And by the way, how do we even measure it? And how did we measure it before? I don't see
mm.
much of that happening.
Yeah, that's totally true. Also, in my practice, in the work with my clients, there is not a lot of really evidence-based decision making within the companies that I see at this point. Um, Nancy, you mentioned the element of equity, and I do know that you also work a lot about with the topic of unconscious bias, diversity, equity, inclusion, and we talked previously in one of our conversations about how for example, marginalized groups felt being more included during the high wave of the pandemic when everybody was forced to work from home, because due to the remote work element, they felt being less excluded.
Exactly.
So when we talk about creating again a psychologically safe hybrid workplace and taking into consideration those marginalized groups that felt safer apparently while they were able to work remotely, what would you suggest organizations to think about?
Well, I think first to have ask employees under what conditions, what makes them feel safe, what makes, and I wouldn't word it that way, but that's what we want to get at. So I would ask people. I'd probably set up focus groups, have one-on-one interviews. What I'm seeing with the clients I work with are that there's certain kinds of people, women. I'd say in women in general find it much more stressful to be in the office for a number of reasons. People who are in the minority within their company feel it stressful to have to come in and perhaps not be their authentic selves and have to do what some call code switch. So to try to be like the people who are around them rather than be themselves. Whereas when we worked all virtually, we were all across the same table from each other. And we didn't have, some people had side conversations with the boss, or some people got invited to the lunches or the conferences or to present at a senior leadership meeting. There was none of that. There might have been some of that, but it was really minimal. I think everyone felt like we were at parity, and suddenly that playing field is being uneven again if we're not careful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very good points that you're making here. Thanks a lot for sharing them. I was also wondering, the return to office conversation, how does it affect you as a trainer, the return to the on-site teaching or on-site training conversation? How is that going for you?
Well, there I have had some on-site classes since COVID. I've probably had maybe just maybe 6 in the last 6 months. Most are still virtual. The toughest the toughest one for me, and I think for most of us when it comes to training or meeting facilitation, is when there are some people in the room and some people remote, which is absolutely the way of the world right now. In fact, that's probably what I'm being asked to help with more than anything. How do we have a hybrid team? How do we have hybrid meetings that maintain equity, where we hear all voices, that keep everyone engaged? And that, I think one thing companies can do for their employees is have really well equipped conference rooms that are set up for hybrid work, where people in the room can see people who are not in the room and vice versa, and really make some investments. Because I'll tell you, it so many of my clients, even very ones with very deep pockets, people complain that the conference rooms aren't ready to go. It takes 15 minutes to get everything working. And honestly, if we're going to be a hybrid organization, invest in the technology.
Mm, I think those are really important points. We have been running with two colleagues just recently it was a virtual facilitator training for a company. So we were training their internal change consultants or change advisors. And interestingly, I was getting in touch with other colleagues to sort of confirm numbers on how many managers are trained in how to run good meetings. And apparently, Stephen Rogelberg, Elise Keith was so kind to forward me an article. Stephen Rogelberg published a data about 20% of all managers are trained to run good meetings. So now we know that if there are only 20% managers who run maybe good meetings, how many of them are really able to run good hybrid meetings? And I was like, dear God, there's so much. And I just did a post about that today, because in the Harvard Business Review article, I think they published a meeting calculator, no? And also Google has set up a feature about how you see in the Google invite how much the meeting could cost if all those people were involved. So we do see there's a lot of potential there. And also, as you were saying, Nancy, rightly, it's about being equitable, being creating an equity environment when it comes to hybrid setups. So when you think about that, what would be your 3 top tips when it comes to hybrid meetings here for managers then?
Oh, 3 top tips. Well, one is, I think my above all is create, not as a management team, but as a company, get input, create principles and norms that help guide policies and interpretation of policies and implement policies. So don't just come up with some random policy because the three of your competitors have done the same thing. Really take the time to think, what are the values and beliefs that we need to reflect in our policies, and then communicate them well. I think another is check frequently with your employees, whether it's through focus groups, a pulse survey of some kind, whether you're asking managers to collect data, but find out what's working. This is a time of experimentation for everyone. I don't think the dust may never settle, but it's certainly not going to settle in the next year or two. So see this as an experiment, yet at the same time, make what you're doing today somewhat stable so employees can count on it. And when you have recruits, you can answer them definitively the extent to which you're flexible or not, because that comes up a lot. Employers will say, well, today we are, but we don't know about tomorrow. Well, no one's going to want to work there under those conditions. And then the third is be honest. Really be honest and be clear, whether it's whatever your rationale is, and be honest about that, and be intentional about making sure the office is a place that it's a magnet that people really want to come to. They're glad at the end of the day when they get home. Oh yeah, this commute was terrible, but it was so worth it because of X, Y, and Z. I'm so glad I went in today. That to me is the goal.
Fantastic recommendations, Nancy. Nancy, thanks so much for sharing. I was just looking through with one of my previous guests. We were talking a lot about the meeting owl, which also I've seen a lot of tech setups, but still for me was always like the easiest and a very well functioning was still the meeting owl from Owl Labs, which works perfectly. You can even connect it, I think since a year or something, with the whiteboard, which also works in a hybrid context really, really very well. And it's not a super huge investment. At the end, the meeting owl is 1,000 pound. Let's put a whiteboard on it. So it's not like 10,000 per meeting room investment. And that's really interesting. We do know that remote work and hybrid work is a superpower. So we hope that all of you out there got something interesting for your own work, for your own virtual or hybrid work. Don't forget to connect with Nancy on LinkedIn, Nancy Settle Murphy, and check out guidedinsights.com. And with that, Nancy, I thank you so much for being here again, for taking the time. I really enjoy reading through your posts every day. There is always an inspiration out there where I think like, wow, good point that she's making here. So thanks a lot for sharing your knowledge, and also, being a guest on our show here. It was a pleasure to have you, Nancy.
Thank you for having me. It's a real privilege. I love our conversations.
I still have a virtual cocktail prepared for you backstage, and I'll join you in a minute.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for being with us today in this conversation about magnets and mandates and how to use them in the return to office conversation. You know that we have already on our webpage, virtualspacehero.com, if you go to the tab of virtual events, all the guests until June are lined up. And we have also this year again a mix of experts from across the globe who will talk about virtual work, hybrid work settings, dynamics, and also virtual learning. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you all in the upcoming sessions. You know that if you're not able to join live to provide us with your question, you always have the possibility to send it to me beforehand, and I will make sure to put them into the conversation with our expert. And with that, don't forget to become a virtual space hero. See you next week. Bye.